Hey guys, I am the Comics Kid 2099 and I am here to review a book, The Greatest Superman Stories Ever Told. This is a book that I got a while back. I want to say it was maybe a month ago. I did a haul video talking about a few of the books that I had gotten on that trip. It was actually all of the books that I had gotten on that trip. And this is the first one from that trip that I've read, I think. I don't think that I read any of the others before this one. The reason that it took me so long, one, this is a really long book, and I didn't read every single issue here. I'll get to that in a minute. But two, it's just taken me a while. There were some of these issues that were kind of a chore to get through, and so I would only read, say, an issue a day. And so there were times when I wasn't reading this book at all. There were times when I was reading one, maybe two issues a day. Toward the end, I was reading a lot more because I was getting a little bit more invested in it. And then also, there was a week where I was working somewhere, and long story short, I did not have the time to really sit down and read this book. So if it's been a month since I got this book and I'm only just now getting to it, now you kind of know a little bit of the reason why. As for some of the issues not being particularly good, it's not a whole lot of the issues. I found that a lot of this is a lot better than what I thought it would be. I've had this kind of idea in my mind for a long time now that DC Comics didn't really start being good until maybe the 1980s. That's when Alan Moore started working on Swamp Thing. That's when Frank Miller did some of his seminal work on Batman. That's when you had George Perez on Wonder Woman, Cary Bates on Captain Atom, Mike Byrne on The Flash. A lot of this was late 80s, but the 80s was really the time when you started seeing some really fantastic stuff from DC Comics. Keith Giffen on the Legion of Superheroes, Marv Wolfman on Teen Titans. This was all starting in the 1980s. Before that, I didn't ever really think there was anything worth reading from DC Comics. And I wasn't just making this up out of thin air. I had read some stuff from the 1960s, and I always thought that was okay, but it's not nearly as good as what Marvel was putting out in the 1960s. If you look at something like, say, Crisis on Earth 1, which was from like 1963 maybe, it was a Justice League story that was a two-parter. If you read that, and then you read something from Marvel in 1963, the stuff from Marvel, no matter what you pick, is going to be quite a bit better. So I always just kind of assumed everything from DC before the 1980s wasn't really worth reading. And I think this book kind of proved me wrong a little bit. There's a few issues. It starts, I believe, in like the late 30s or early 40s, and then it goes all the way up to 1986. So the first issue that's collected here is from Superman issue 4 from 1940, and then the last issue that's collected is from Superman issue 2 from 1986. That would be the post-Crisis on Infinite Earths John Byrne run. Basically, when you are collecting a wide variety of stories in a book like this, some of them are going to be really enjoyable, and some of them aren't really going to be that good. For example, in the early days, I want to say that people like Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, they had some really great ideas. In fact, these are the guys who created the character of Superman, and they created a lot of really great ideas, but when you go and read an issue that they did, a lot of their execution is very lacking. For example, as far back as 1940, these guys would say, oh, okay, now we've got a problem that Superman can't easily get out of. Why don't we suddenly give him telekinesis beams or something like that? Back as far as 1940, this was a problem where writers would just give Superman brand new powers. A lot of people, I have heard them talk about how that was a big thing in the 1960s, where Superman would suddenly have rainbow beams coming out of his hand, or suddenly he could shrink somebody with his mind. That was a thing in the 1960s. It was also kind of a thing in the 1940s. Some of these issues are pretty good, and some of them, I'm wondering if it's more nostalgia that is the reason that they are in this book and less that they are actually good. And on that same note, some of these stories definitely aren't really as good as they could be, but they are collected here, I think, because they are significant. For example, we have the first appearance of Mr. Mixius Spitlick. We have the first comic book appearance of Bizarro. We have the first appearance of Lori Lamaris, etc. Some of these stories, they aren't really good stories. even if you compare them to other things that DC Comics was doing at the time, they aren't really that good, but they are collected here because they are significant to the lore of Superman. And then some of these stories are really fantastic. There are a couple of imaginary stories which have nothing to do with the DC universe at the time, and so, for example, in one of these stories, Superman dies, and then Supergirl becomes the next protector of Earth. I thought that story was pretty good. But even that story looks like garbage compared to the next imaginary story, which is the introduction of Superman Red and Superman Blue. Now, if you were reading comics in the 1990s, or you were at least familiar with Superman comics from the 1990s, you know there was a brief period where Superman was made of electricity or something, and he had a brand new blue and white costume. A lot of people really hated this era of Superman. They really hated the costume. I've talked about that a little bit before. Also, during that time, there was a second Superman who had a red and white costume. And basically, as far as I understand it, both of these guys were aspects of the original Superman. That got its start all the way back in like 1962. There was a story where a person from the city of Kandor calls up Superman and says, "Hey, listen, you've made a couple of promises over the years, and you have failed to keep any of these promises. So, in 6 more months, if you have not kept any of those promises, we suggest that you come to live in Kandor, and one of us will go out there and try to do the things that you have failed to do." So then Superman makes himself even smarter than he already is. He creates a double of himself, and then one of them gets to marry Lana Lang, one of them gets to marry Lois Lane. They create a new Krypton for the city of Kandor to be enlarged on, so that whole new Krypton story from about 5 years ago that Sterling Gates and James Robinson were involved in, that got its start way back in the early 1960s. I had no idea about that. I think some of the best stories here are the ones that really don't feel beholden to any sort of continuity, and they can just do whatever they want. The best stories here are the ones where Superman can just make himself into a super genius, and he can create a second Superman out of himself. And then they can both eliminate all evil, and they can create a new Krypton, and one of them gets to marry the girl, and the other one gets to marry the other girl. You never got to see any of this completely awesome, throw out all the rules stories in the real stories. It was the imaginary stories in this book that I feel like really captured my attention the most. And while I did say that some of these stories aren't really good and are just here because they are significant, some of the stories actually are good. Some of the ones from around the 1970s and 80s, those are pretty good. For example, the story Must There Be a Superman is a story where the Guardians from the Green Lantern comics, they kind of sort of suggest to Superman that maybe he is causing more of a problem on Earth than he is actually helping the people of Earth. They are suggesting that he is causing social stagnation and that he is helping the people of Earth with problems that really they should be helping themselves with. And it's a really interesting story, and it doesn't actually have a happy ending. It kind of ends in a place where you're like, you know what, that was very interesting. Those guys kind of had a point, and I was not expecting that level of sophistication from the 1970s. And then you have stories here that I have read before, and that's why I didn't read them this time through. For example, For the Man Who Has Everything is a story by Alan Moore, where Wonder Woman, Batman, and Jason Todd are going to Superman's birthday party at the Fortress of Solitude, and we find that Mongol is already there, and he has put this giant flower on Superman's chest, and it is called, I think, the Black Mercy, and it gives Superman his own little fantasy world that he can enjoy. And it's a really interesting story. It's very good. Of course, it's by Alan Moore. Most of the time, he presents really good stories. I had read that story before in an Alan Moore collection a while back, so I didn't read it this time. And also, Superman issue 2 from the Man of Steel era, that's the issue where Lex Luthor finds out who Superman is and he doesn't believe what the information is given to him. That's also, it's pretty good. I've gone on record to say before that I do not like the John Byrne era of Superman very much at all, so I didn't read that issue either because I had read it once before already. overall, if you ask me, is this book worth getting? I would say, yeah, if you see this book, go ahead and get it. If anything, if you are like me and you don't really have a lot of faith in the pre-crisis DC Comics, I would say get this just so that you can be surprised. There's some really great stories here. There's some that's not as good, but a lot of them did surprise me. And I think that's what's important here. These stories are very engaging. They're very surprising. And I've kind of gone a lot of my comic book reading life thinking that the Silver Age of DC Comics was kind of just something that I didn't need to worry about. Now I kind of want to go back and read a lot of Silver Age stuff. Now granted, a lot of it may be kind of like some of the stories here that I did not enjoy, but I feel like maybe there's going to be other gems out there that weren't collected here that are maybe as good or better than the stories that I did enjoy. So I definitely think if you've never read anything like this, go ahead and try and find this and see if you enjoy it. If you are more into the post-crisis stuff, maybe you won't enjoy this. That is a risk that you are going to take, but I still think you should probably give this book a chance. You will probably like what you read. That's about all I have to say here. I personally really enjoyed this book for the most part. I would give it a firm recommendation. If you like this video, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Do all of the things that you love doing on YouTube videos. And I will be back tomorrow with an entirely different kind of video for you guys. So until then, I will see you guys later. Have a great day.